This week on Jerusalem Dateline, a political earthquake in Israel. For the first time in 12 years, Israeli political parties form a coalition government without Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. But can this fragile coalition last? And CBN's exclusive interview with former U.S. Ambassador to Israel, David Friedman. Plus, a new president whose father was also an Israeli president. All this and more this week on Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. After marathon negotiations and at the 11th hour, Yair Lapid and Naftali Bennett succeeded in forming a coalition government. The political earthquake shook Israel and means for the first time in 12 years, it's possible Benjamin Netanyahu might no longer be Israel's prime minister. Members of the coalition called it a new beginning.
Today, we succeeded. We made history. We held our promise, as we always promised you to tell the truth and to do what we said we will do. Tonight, we've succeeded.
The coalition of parties from right, center, left, and for the first time in Israel's history, an Arab Islamist party united around the main goal of bringing down Prime Minister Netanyahu.
Throughout the last campaign and also for the last 2 months, I reiterated and promised that the Labour Party would make every effort to form a government that would replace the Netanyahu regime.
Bennett, a religious conservative and a former ally of Netanyahu, and Lapid, a leader of the secular left, agreed to rotate the office of Prime Minister, with Bennett going first for 2 years and then Lapid for 2 years. Yet it's uncertain this fragile coalition will last that long, and if their common animosity towards Netanyahu will be enough to keep their government together. The 8 parties in the coalition represent ideologies from opposing ends of the political spectrum. Former U.S. Ambassador to Israel told CBN News the question is if they can work together.
This is a very unusual government as it is laid out because while they are unified as a coalition, they've never been unified in terms of the political principles upon which they have built their parties. So what I'm waiting to find out really is, not what is the unity that brought them together, because we all know that's relatively shallow, but what are the unifying principles upon which they will govern?
The agreement still needs to be approved by a Knesset vote early next week. If sworn in, it will prevent the country from going to its 5th election in just more than 2 years and end the 12-year rule of Netanyahu, the longest-serving prime minister in Israel's history. Joining me by Skype to discuss what's ahead for this new Israeli government are CBN senior editor John Wagi and Middle East correspondent Julie Stahl. John, Julie, great to be with you, and thanks for joining us. It took the last day, the 11th hour of the last day, but Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid seem to have had their coalition together. John, your reaction to this new government in the making?
Well, interesting you mentioned the 11th hour, Chris, because really and truly the only thing that unites this government that I could see is a dislike for Netanyahu and a desire to oust him from power. And you even see that in the headlines, both in Israel and in the United States. It's about ousting Netanyahu. Now, at this critical time, how Israelis look at it and see how a unity government, so-called, is going to unite.
Yeah, Julie, we have a few days before the Knesset's actually going to vote to ratify this government. It's still a government in the making. What are we looking ahead to the next week or so?
Well, like as you said, Chris, that there's going to be this jockeying going on. For sure, Prime Minister Netanyahu is going to be trying his best to rattle this coalition or this coalition in the making. They have to be able to hold together through a vote. Whether or not that happens, we'll see. Also like Naftali Bennett, some people thought perhaps he might have a guilty conscience, that he promised that he wouldn't sit with Yair Lapid and he wouldn't sit with this one and that one, and here he is. He's joining this kind of, whatever they're calling it, this conglomeration, this unity government, and we'll see how that plays out.
This unity government, I think it's important to note, has been cheer-led from the very beginning, even starting years before this, by media in Israel and sometimes outside of Israel. And I think that's an important thing to note. This is not really a coalition approved at this point by the voters. This is a coalition led by the media and political leaders who are jockeying for a coalition.
Julie, some of your final thoughts about the situation right now.
So, Chris, it's really important that people understand that most of this country, a large majority of this country, something like 70% or at least 70 seats in the Knesset, are really right-wing, solidly right-wing, and really hold the same views. Really, the only thing they don't like is Benjamin Netanyahu. And one analyst said today that he thought he could foresee a scenario where perhaps this new government would have to ask Benjamin Netanyahu, in the face of a large security crisis, to come back and join them in the government, and in order to use his wisdom and be able to really hold together in a crisis.
John, final question to you. What does the future look like for Benjamin Netanyahu, and how can Christians that really love Israel be praying during this time?
I think the most important thing to pray for is that the Lord's plans be enacted in Israel right now, and that there be given great wisdom to voters, to political leaders. As far as Netanyahu himself goes, if he's the Lord's man for the job at this moment, the events on the ground will change. And if there has to be a period where they see what life is like without him, that could be part of the equation too. We just don't know for sure. But I think it's interesting that people say that Netanyahu's done some good things in the past, but it's time for him to go. Maybe that's understandable after 12 years of being prime minister, but this isn't what the people voted for. I mean, they voted for his party far more than any other party.
Coming up, a CBN News exclusive interview with former U.S. Ambassador to Israel, David Friedman. The recent war between Hamas and Israel sparked a debate in the U.S. Congress about support for the State of Israel. During the current recess on Capitol Hill, it was an opportunity for some leaders, like Senator Lindsey Graham, to visit Israel and show their support for the Jewish state. He met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu with a sign that said, "More for Israel." He explained that in our one-on-one interview with the senator.
The more Hezbollah, Hamas, and Iran try to destroy Israel, the more I want to help. So I had a sign that was a simple message, more for Israel. This talk of cutting aid is ridiculous.
He came with a message to his Senate colleagues and House members who want to cut aid to Israel.
Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran are radical Islamic terrorist organizations and a nation state that would remake the region in their own image, that would destroy the state of Israel because under their religious doctrine, there's no place for the Jewish state. If you don't get that, you don't understand the conflict.
Graham came with an alternative to the Iranian nuclear deal.
The current course the world is on with Iran is a disaster. There is no way to give the Iranians an enrichment capability that will not lead to a bomb, in my view. So let's test the Iranians. They say they want peaceful nuclear power. You can have it. The world will provide you the fuel rods you need to run the reactor. There'll be an international fuel bank. You don't need to enrich.
For Graham, helping Israel is personal.
I'm a Christian. I believe that God blesses those who bless Israel. And the people who want to destroy Israel will destroy us if they could. And if you don't get that, you don't understand the times we're living in.
And for Senator Graham, Jerusalem is like no other place on earth.
It's God's zip code. It's the holiest of the holies for my faith, the Jewish people, Islam. It's a special place. It's God's city. And it is the capital of Israel, and I'm glad we got that right.
CBN News also sat down with former U.S. Ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, for this exclusive interview. He warned about the dangers of the current negotiations if the U.S. re-enters the Iranian nuclear deal. Well, Ambassador Friedman, great to see you again, this time as a private citizen, not as official ambassador. Great to see you.
Yeah, great to be with you, Chris. Thank you.
Iran is looming there in the
casting a shadow over the whole region. What are your concerns about Iran's ways that it could try to disrupt the Abraham Accords?
Well, look, Iran right now is weak, financially extremely weak. Doesn't mean they're not making mischief, but my view is whatever mischief they're going to make regardless. I mean, they're not trustworthy, and we learned from the efforts of the Mossad just how untrustworthy they are, and we saw when they were given funds, they didn't use it to build hospitals or build schools, but rather just to continue malign behavior. So Iran is, I believe, a constant right now. They are going to engage in malign behavior. The question is, do we want to empower that behavior, or do we want to weaken that behavior? The Trump administration weakened Iran. They're far less of a threat than they were in 2016. If we keep that pressure on, I believe we will get to the right place. A true, as they say, longer, stronger, meaningful, verifiable deal with Iran down the road. But we still have no choice. If we don't do that, and Iran is now empowered again to really disrupt the Middle East, the first thing they're going to go after is the Abraham Accords. Find ways to disrupt the relations between Israel and these nations, because this is the fundamental threat to Iran. Peaceful coexistence within the region between Israel and the modern Sunni states is what they care about disrupting the most. So, look, I mean, we're heading into a very critical period in all these relationships, and I hope the Biden administration treads very carefully. I've said this before, elections do have consequences, and I would expect policies to change in a Democratic administration and accept that. But don't change policies just because they were Trump policies. I mean, that's a bad reason to change something. Change it because it's wrong, but don't change it because it's a Trump policy, because a lot of the Trump policies were right.
Right now, they're negotiating indirectly with Iran right now in Vienna. What are your concerns about the idea that the U.S. will re-enter the Iranian nuclear deal?
I have tremendous concerns. This is my greatest concern for the region, and I think it would be a terrible mistake. And I've said it many times. Lots of others have said it many times. I think there are many strong voices inside Washington, including people within Congress, who feel strongly about this. And I do hope that the right view prevails.
Yeah. If the sanctions are lifted, could the money that goes to Iran end up funding Hezbollah and Hamas that are threatening Israel?
I think there's a 100% probability that will happen, yes. Of course it will.
And could that lead to a regional war? That's something Ambassador Michael Oren just said a few days ago.
Preventing Iran from having a nuclear weapon is of course, extraordinarily important. But the price for Iran not having a nuclear weapon, again, I don't believe you can verify it anyway. But if the price is funding a regional war within the Middle East with a stronger Hezbollah and a stronger Hamas and a stronger Palestinian Islamic Jihad, I mean, that's a ridiculous price to pay. I mean, no one should be paying in that currency, which is what would happen now if we reinflate Iran's economy.
Ambassador Friedman, great to be with you again. Much success, the Patzlahar, on the documentary, your book, and great to be with you again.
Well, thank you so much, Chris.
Up next, Israel chooses the son of its sixth president to be Israel's next president. Israel's Knesset has elected Jewish Agency Chairman Isaac Herzog as the country's 11th president. Every 7 years, a new president is chosen for the largely figurehead role. Herzog comes from a long line of distinguished Israeli leaders.
I intend to be the president of everyone, to listen attentively to every position and to respect every person, to mark connecting lines and build bridges of agreement in order to bring closer the farmost zealots, here within us, as well as with our brothers and sisters in the diaspora.
Isaac Herzog's father played an incredible role in the history of Israel. One of those moments came in the spring of 1967, a time of almost unbearable tension for Israel's leaders. Threats of invasion came from every direction, and Western allies turned their backs. Egypt shut down the Red Sea, while Syria shelled Galilee's villages. But in Israel's darkest hour, a voice of calm emerged to describe the coming miracle. John Wagi explains.
By the end of May 1967, the die was cast. Israel would soon be at war on all borders. Prime Minister Levi Eshkol tried to reassure the nation, but he was ill and faltered during his address. Military General Chaim Herzog stepped in to fill the gap with radio commentary in Hebrew and English.
A new page has been opened in the history of our people's battles and of the courage of Israel. And deep in the heart of each and every one of us at this moment, when we think of those engaged in the struggle, there is, irrespective of whether we normally pray or not, a prayer that the guardian of Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep.
During the Six-Day War, Chaim Herzog didn't just calm the nation. He became Israel's first military ruler over Judea and Samaria in more than 2,000 years. He was also a powerful presence as UN ambassador and later as president of Israel. Chaim Herzog died in 1997, but his legacy lives on. His son Isaac was only 7 when the war broke out. Still, he remembers the prevailing fear.
What we know is that there was a period of awaiting about 3 weeks before the war, where the national mood was Auschwitz. Israel is going to its second Holocaust. Whoever leaves last should turn off the light and leave the country. That was the mood.
Isaac's older brother Michael, now a retired major general, was 15 at the time. He says there's no doubt Israelis were concerned about the nation's survival.
So I still remember ourselves, like many other people in Israel, digging a trench in our backyard because we expected that we would be shelled, and we were shelled. Tel Aviv was shelled by the Jordanians during the Six-Day War.
The young people who have abandoned the cafes of Dizengoff Street and the discotheque, the farm boys, the yeshiva students, the members of the youth movements, the boys of the immigrant townships, all are at this moment shoulder to shoulder fighting in the air, on the land, and on the sea for our right simply to live.
You know what's interesting is we hear a lot today about the term fake news and that kind of thing. 67 was a banner year for fake news, especially in Egypt and in Syria, and your father was kind of counteracting that to a people that didn't know really what was happening. They had to hear the truth.
We would hear what was called Kol Kahir, Voice of Cairo, and they would speak in Hebrew, and they would say the worst things. We're going to throw you to the sea. I guess you heard it.
They said terrible things, and there was anxiety, but he provided very professional analysis. First of all, he knew the situation.
I am broadcasting from Jerusalem to the sound of heavy shelling. A strange form of quiet and anticipation has fallen along the front line, a quiet that may foretell great tidings.
He would broadcast 3 times a day. He would also broadcast in English, so there were both BBC and others, but the 3 times a day you would walk in the streets of Tel Aviv and you would hear his voice throughout the city, people just listening, stopping and listening. And it was awesome. I heard his voice in the trench. I heard my dad, my mom brought a little radio, and we would hear him in the trench, and he calmed us down.
I was told by soldiers in the front lines, and they would listen to him, and I was told by quite a few of them that this really boosted their morale before going into battle.
Just 1 day into the war, Israel's Air Force virtually destroyed the capacity of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan to strike from the air. On the ground, Israel's army penetrated deep into the Sinai and pushed toward Jordan on the West Bank. By day 3, Chaim Herzog could tell the nation the unthinkable. After 2 millennia, Jerusalem was back in Jewish hands.
The miracle of our generation continues, as does the brilliant campaign, the like of which there is no record of in the history of Israel, and perhaps in the history of the nations, and which has achieved today what millions of Jews throughout the generations have prayed for.
We live in a very different era than 1967, but in my mind, what our father, the impact his broadcast had on national morale is reminiscent of the impact that Churchill's broadcast had on British morale during World War II, and that was very significant.
And indeed the saying goes, Jerusalem is a gift of the whole land of Israel. On the altar of the Temple Mount and Mount Moriah, the people of Israel offered up today priceless sacrifices which swell the toll of sacrifice by earlier generations. Our victory was not lightly achieved, and at this moment it is well that we remember those who offered up their lives for the glory of the Almighty and the nation.
John Wagi, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Well, that's all for this edition. Thanks for joining us. Remember, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. And you can also access CBN content through our CBN News and other CBN apps. And don't forget to sign up for our email blast so you can continue to receive all of our exciting CBN content. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.
이 프로그램은 여러분의 미디어 선교 후원으로 제작되었습니다. 선교는 사명, 후원은 동역. 당신도 복음을 전할 수 있습니다. 선교 후원 02-6333-1003번